Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made for Shimmerz Paints. To create this layout, I used the December Color Kits collection. I love to use strips of paper on my layouts, so I cut out a number of strips. They all measure 3/4 of an inch wide. I knew that I wanted to ink the edges of all of the strips. I considered using Distress Oxide in Forest Moss, but then I decided that I wanted to use a little bit of a darker color, so I decided to go with Distress ink in Vintage Photo. And I inked the edges of all of those strips that I cut out. Earlier in the month, I made another layout that had Christmas trees, and I used a lot of different pattern papers for that. So I liked the combination that I used in that layout, so I used those same papers for this layout. Because I love to use strips of pattern paper, I've used them in many different ways over the years. I got the idea for this layout when I was making some Christmas trees earlier this month for a different layout. I used this same configuration where I put the strips of paper on angles, and I was able to make Christmas trees this way. I thought that by making the strips a little larger and then covering a larger area with the strips, I could create a different kind of look. I started off with a 6 by 12 inch piece of white cardstock. I measured 6 inches down, which is halfway on the right hand side. I made a mark, and then I used my ruler and a pencil, and I drew a line from both of the opposite corners to that line, and that created a large 45-degree angle. And then I used those lines that I drew as a guide to place the strips of paper down on the page. I used ATG adhesive, and I put down the first 2 strips going along the line that I drew, and then I put more strips to the left and additional strips to the right until that entire piece of paper is filled up. I knew that there was going to be just a tiny area that wasn't covered by that last strip on the left, so I put a little piece of pattern paper underneath it so that there wouldn't be a white space on that spot. Then I trimmed all the strips off of the left-hand side, and then I used some of those papers and put them on the right-hand side of that initial right angle that I made with the pencil lines. I roughly cut the top and bottom strips a little bit shorter so that I could fit that paper in my trimmer, and then I used my trimmer to cut all of the edges and have a nice clean rectangle to use on my layout. I'm going to use the paper with the strips on it that I just made on the left-hand side of my layout, and I wanted to have some mixed media on the right-hand side. What you're seeing here is a mixed media background that I made for another layout. I didn't end up liking the pinkish red background for that particular layout, but instead of throwing it away, I decided that this would be perfect to adapt and use for this layout. The paper that I'm using for my mixed media background is a piece of 120-pound smooth white cardstock that I've covered with some gesso. The colors that I'm using are a Vibez called Cherry Christmas. That's that really lovely pink and red color that I have already down on the background. And then I also add some Christmas cheer. That is a Shimmerz. Now, some of this didn't record, but you could see that I added several layers to the right-hand side of the layout. Now I know that I'm going to be using this background not for the Christmas tree layout, but for this layout. So I'm concentrating the paint on the right-hand side because that's where it will be seen. You can see that now there's a pencil line drawn down the center of the layout. That's just to give me an idea of where I have to put the color. Here you can see that I'm adding lots of splatters to that area of color. I really like the way you could see lots of different layers of colors, and the splatters are a little bit darker than everything else on the layout, and I think that that makes a really nice effect. And then I wanted to add some of this color called Christmas Cheer. I already have some of it down the layout, but I wanted to add a little bit more of it, especially around the outside of the area of color. And then I added a bit of water, and I'm using my paintbrush to splatter that color all over the large area where I have the paints, and then also around the perimeter of that area. I want to remember to mention that when you place an order with Shimmerz Paints and you use my name in the comments, you'll receive a free gift. Shimmerz Paints has a lot more than paint. If you would like to check out the website, the link is in the description box. I also leave a link to the current color kits there as well. Now I'm using a stencil that's in my stash. I don't know the manufacturer of this stencil, but it has some kind of medium-sized dots, and they are slightly different sizes. So I'm using some modeling paste through this stencil, and I like the way this adds a cool, almost snowball effect to the background, which I think is perfect for this Christmas layout. And then I'm using one of my favorite stencils of all time. This is the Tim Holtz dot fade stencil. I like the idea of having the two different stencils working together, the really tiny dots and then also those medium-sized dots. I want to mention that that first round of stenciling was dry before I started using the other stencil on the layout. I wanted to create some kind of a decorative trim for the area between the mixed media side of the layout and the pattern paper side of the layout. So I used a Martha Stewart punch, and I punched out a border strip from one of the pattern papers. I used some distress ink to ink the edges of that strip of paper, and then I decided to ink the edges of the entire large rectangle while I was at it, and then I added some adhesive to the edge with just part of the punched out pattern showing. I just wanted there to be a little bit of a delicate edge, but I didn't want to make it too large. Then I put lots of ATG adhesive on the back of that paper, and I attached it down to the left-hand side of the mixed media page that I made. So now I'll have the pattern paper on the left and the mixed media on the right. And I'm using 2 photos of my daughters on Christmas Eve several years ago. And for some reason, after I take a couple of serious pictures of them, they start getting silly and doing different poses. And I have to say that sometimes I get a little frustrated in the moment, but then when I see the pictures, those are usually the best pictures. They have the most energy, and I really love using those. So those are 2 of those kind of silly pictures that we seem to get every time there's a holiday. Both of the photos are first mounted on some white cardstock and then again on some green cardstock for the photo on the right and some cranberry cardstock for the photo on the left. On the left-hand side of my mat, you can see I have a number of die-cut embellishments that I'm going to be using on the layout. I also wanted to use some of the stickers, and I wanted to be able to move them around the layout, so I stuck quite a few of them onto some white cardstock, and then I fussy cut them out. Now I'm using the Distress ink in Vintage Photo once again, and I'm inking the edges of all of these pieces so that there'll be a little bit of contrast between those and the background. For the title, I used a die in my stash, and I cut the word Merry out first from some pattern paper and then also from a piece of craft paper that I had in my stash. I inked the edges of both of those pieces, and I'm going to attach the pattern paper word Merry on top of the craft paper Merry, but I'm going to just slightly offset the 2 of them so you can see the darker color behind the green paper. And I'm going to have the title in the upper right-hand corner. I'm beginning to embellish the page using all of those embellishments that I inked earlier. I have these really beautiful holly leaves that I'm putting in both of the opposite corners where I'm going to have my clusters. I put a little bit of foam on the backs of the leaves so that they would pop off of the layout a little bit just to give them some dimension. And then I use ATG adhesive to attach those down to the layout. I love the ATG adhesive, especially for making clusters because I like to move things around a lot, and I'm usually able to reposition elements with the ATG adhesive. I use this cute little strip on the very bottom of the layout. I don't end up leaving that there. I think that there was so much going on the layout and it looked kind of busy, so I decided that that wasn't a necessary element, and I removed that in a little while. Initially, I was thinking that the clusters would be rather small, but I kept adding more and more embellishments and liking the way that they looked. So the clusters do end up growing to a little bit larger size than I had originally planned, but that's okay. I tucked some hearts into both of the clusters and then also some small branches. I included a candy cane in the cluster on the lower right. And I forgot to mention that I added some bells on top of the photos. One is a little bit bigger, and then I popped up the one that was a little bit smaller, again for a little bit of dimension. I put some adhesive on the back of the title, and I also included some holly leaves in the title cluster. Here I have one of the dots from the color Kitz. I love these dots, and I thought that this one with the tree on it would look nice between the two photos, kind of connecting them together. I placed a leaf underneath the title, and then I used another one of those leaves to the left of the Christmas tree dots that's between both of the photos. And then I had used these banners on another layout, and they just didn't work out. They made the layout a little bit too busy, and I really wanted to use them. So I thought that it worked out perfectly that they fit so nicely underneath both of the photos. So I attached those down. Then I began expanding those clusters a little bit more. I added a pine tree to the cluster on the bottom right, and then I also added a similar one on the upper left-hand cluster. And that caused me to have to move some of the elements in those clusters around a little bit. There's a large heart that I keep moving around the layout, and it finally ends up on the layout, but not where it is currently. And then I wanted to have yet another tree in my clusters, so I put some foam behind this tree to give it a little bit of dimension. I like the way that lighter green tree that I just added contrasted a little bit with the background because it's a different color green. So I decided that since I like the one in the upper left-hand corner, I would put another one in the lower right-hand corner. I also added some foam to the one in the lower right-hand corner so that it would also have some dimension. I decided to move the leaf that was underneath the title down to where I have the dot with the Christmas tree on it. And then I was thinking that those leaves looked nice peeking out from underneath the dot, but they were just a little bit too big for that area. So I trimmed both of them down, and then I put them together on the left-hand side of the dot. I had my title attached down, but I felt that it needed a little bit of dimension. I really like dimension on my layouts, and I thought that the title just needed a little bit of something additional. So I cut out more layers of that die cut. I used some white cardstock. I layered them on top of each other, and then I attached down the titles that I had put on the layout earlier, and that just gave the title a little bit more emphasis. I had moved that large heart around the layout a little bit, and I finally put it up by the title, and I thought it was perfect in that spot. Next, I added some bling to the layout. I'm using some glossy accents, and I'm using my tweezers and some loose jewels that I had in my stash. These are not self-adhesive. I started off with some medium-sized jewels on the photo corners, and then I put some very, very tiny jewels between each of the sections of both of the banners that are underneath the photo. I added a number of jewels to all of those trees that are in both of the clusters. As you could see, me adding jewels to the layout requires my head to be in the video, so I don't include a lot of footage of me adding the jewels, but I can say that I use glossy accents, I use tweezers, and on this layout I used a variety of different colors on the trees. I wanted to include some of those same pink jewels that I used on the holly leaves, so I included those jewels along with some gold and brown and silver colored jewels. In my scrapbooking room, I have a binder that has a whole bunch of die cuts that are left over from other projects, and I've been using that binder quite a bit lately. I felt like I needed a few little floral pieces in the clusters, but I didn't want to add a ton of them, and I had just the right amount of these very small pine branches, so I cut a lot of them into smaller pieces and then added them to both of the clusters and also to the title cluster where I have the heart and the holly leaves, and then I used some gel glue to attach them down. Now I'm using a little bit of gesso to clean up some of the spots on the layout where I have color in areas that I didn't really want it in. So I use the gesso to fade out those spots, and I think that's really helpful for making the layout look a little clean. Even though it's a mixed media layout, it doesn't have to look super messy, if that makes sense. I'm adding some shimmer to the pine branches using some opal glitter medium from Hobby Lobby. I'm also using a little piece of paper so that I don't get the medium all over everything else on the page. That was the very last touch. This layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. This layout is a little busier than a lot of the other layouts that I've made, but I really enjoyed creating it, especially the mixed media part. I always love doing that part of the layout, and I want to say thank you so much for watching this process video. The link to the Shimmerz Paints website is in the description box if you would like to place an order, and don't forget to use my name in the comments if you would like a free gift. Thanks again so much for watching, everybody. Have a fantastic day. Take care. Bye-bye.